One afternoon in February 1894, a French anarchist named Marshal Bourdin set out on a peculiar mission. He boarded a horse-drawn tram in London, carrying a homemade bomb and a pocket full of cash. His destination was the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. A seemingly odd target. Why attack an observatory? In Bourdin's mind, blowing up the Greenwich Observatory meant striking at something deeper, the center of the world as it was known. At that time, Greenwich was literally the world's timekeeper. It was the prime meridian from which all longitude was measured and clocks were set. It was the symbol of an order that stretched across the globe. Bourdin, the anarchist, wanted to shatter that central point of authority. Unfortunately for him, and very unfortunately for his body, the bomb exploded prematurely in Greenwich Park. Bourdin died of his wounds without ever reaching the observatory. The Royal Observatory stood unscathed, and time, as far as the Victorians knew, kept on ticking from its usual center. Little could Bourdin have known that a young patent clerk in Switzerland was about to do with mathematics what Bourdin failed to do with TNT. In 1905, Albert Einstein published his special theory of relativity, and a decade later his general theory of relativity. These ideas effectively blew up the concept of a single central reference frame for the universe. Einstein showed that there is no privileged center of the cosmos, no single zero point of space and time. Measurements of space and time depend on your frame of reference, and no one frame is more correct than any other. In plain language, Greenwich's status as the center of time was a convenient fiction. The universe has no master clock in Greenwich. All we have are perspectives. Einstein's relativity is often caricatured as everything is relative, but it doesn't mean there's no truth. It means that truths come with coordinates attached. For example, in his 1917 book Relativity, Einstein illustrated frames of reference by imagining a tram moving through Berlin. In the German edition, he used Potsdamer Platz as a reference point. English translators later swapped in Trafalgar Square in London. Modern ebooks even updated it to Times Square in New York. The exact location didn't matter. The point was that any location could serve as the origin of your coordinate system. No single spot in the universe is the one true center. As long as you specify your frame of reference, you can describe motion or position. But someone in a different frame, on a moving train or on another planet, might describe the same events differently, and they'd be just as correct in their own frame. Space and time are not absolute. They stretch, shrink, or skew depending on your motion and gravity. Two clocks will disagree if one moves fast or sits in a stronger gravitational field. Cause and effect still exist, but how long events last or how far apart they occur is not set in stone. The implications were huge. Relativity proved that Earth wasn't the center, because there is no single center at all. It's a universe of countless vantage points, each with its own equally valid ticking clock. Naturally, many people at the time threw up their hands. Newspaper columnists joked that only Einstein and maybe two other people truly understood relativity, and everyone else would just pretend. But whether the average person grasped it or not, Einstein's work seeped into the cultural groundwater. The phrase, "everything is relative," became a cliché. The deeper message was this: the old anchors of certainty were gone. Space and time were part of a single fabric, bendable and relative. In a poetic twist of fate, Einstein's paradigm shift accomplished by logic what Bourdin's bomb failed to do by violence. Greenwich, meantime, lost its monopoly on truth. If time itself could bend and stretch, if up and down depended on where you stood, then nothing at the dawn of the 20th century was as stable as it seemed. Relativity was the first crack of thunder in a coming storm of new ideas. After Einstein, the 20th century mind could never retreat to the neat clockwork of Newton's universe. A young patent clerk had quietly yanked the rug out from under the world's feet, and the vertigo was just beginning. At the dawn of the 20th century, the world was still ruled by emperors. In fact, a person born in 1900 could count at least 5 major empires spanning the globe. The British with their Queen Emperor in London, the German Kaiser, the Austro-Hungarian Emperor, the Russian Tsar, the Ottoman Sultan, and that's not even mentioning the French colonial empire or the Japanese emperor. It was a world that, on the surface, hadn't changed politically in centuries. Big thrones, crowns, and pomp still dominated half the planet. Yet storm clouds were gathering. In 1859, a colorful San Francisco eccentric named Joshua Norton had proclaimed himself Emperor of the United States, a totally unofficial and somewhat comic figure who printed his own currency and issued absurd decrees like demanding a bridge be built across the bay. Emperor Norton was humored by the public as a lovable madman, a kind of civic mascot. Little did people know that Emperor Norton's pretend empire was a dark foreshadowing. Within a few decades, the real emperors would fare no better than this delusional California monarch. The First World War came like a great scythe through the ranks of the crowned heads. The war didn't just change who was in power, it obliterated the idea of empire as a viable model. By 1918, the German Kaiser was in exile. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had fractured into pieces, the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, and even far-off Russia saw its Tsar overthrown and shot by revolutionaries. The 19th century had been an age of empires. The 20th century began with all those emperors thrown into the dustbin of history. In hindsight, it seems inevitable. These royals sleepwalking into war and pulling their own houses down. But to people of the time, it was shocking. The world map had to be redrawn almost overnight. Ancient kingdoms, like Austria-Hungary, effectively the Habsburg domain, simply ceased to exist. New nations sprouted from their ruins. The era of noblesse oblige and gilded crowns was gone, replaced by politicians in suits arguing at peace conferences. World War I was more than just a political turning point. It was a psychic break for European civilization. The slaughter was mechanized and senseless on a scale no one had imagined. The optimists who had chirped that war would be over by Christmas in 1914 were instead treated to 4 years of stalemate in muddy trenches with machine guns and poison gas mowing down a generation of young men. Human progress, which 19th century people believed in so earnestly, seemed to turn on itself. As the war ground on, romantic notions of glory and honor evaporated. In their place came shell shock, cynicism, and an abiding sense that something had gone very wrong with Western civilization. Artists and writers captured this disillusionment. The shattered poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, or novels like All Quiet on the Western Front, revealed soldiers grappling with the sheer incomprehensibility of industrialized mass death. These weren't stories of heroism. They were stories of horror. For perhaps the first time, a major war yielded no uplifting myths, only images of muddy trenches and pointless charges. Ask anyone today for symbols of World War I and you'll hear about trenches, barbed wire, poppies on soldiers' graves, static images of futility, not grand victories. The Great War shattered the narrative that war could be noble. It became something to be survived, not celebrated. And survive it the world did, albeit deeply scarred. In November 1918, when the guns fell silent, the old order lay in ruins. The very map had changed shape, and huge empires gone. One British writer, D.H. Lawrence, would later write that the war finished off the old world. And he wasn't just talking about politics. The psychological shock was profound. How do you trust in human rationality after the Somme? How do you trust in God after the machine gun? Many didn't. Instead, a strain of nihilism and cynicism crept into the public mindset. The generation that came of age in the trenches, often called the lost generation, came home convinced that the old men in charge had no idea what they were doing. They had sent millions to their deaths waving flags and mouthing platitudes. Never again, many thought, would they fall for such grand illusions. Of course, as we know now, those hopes of never again would be dashed a mere 2 decades later by an even more devastating conflict, World War II. But interestingly, World War II's narrative felt different. It had clear bad guys and more obvious moral stakes. Culturally, World War II is often depicted with a kind of grim admiration. The good war where people stood against fascism, hence why we have countless heroic movies from The Great Escape to Saving Private Ryan. In contrast, World War I left almost no positive cultural script. It was simply a senseless tragedy, a collapse of the old world order with nothing clear to replace it. The First World War functioned as an acid that ate away at centuries of accumulated certainty. It destroyed empires, it discredited rulers, and it traumatized a generation into questioning the very basis of civilization. The 19th century's orderly world had blown itself apart with howitzers and chlorine gas. To find meaning again, people would have to build something new from the rubble. Some looked to radical politics like communism and fascism, some to personal liberation or art. Some simply numbed the pain in jazz clubs and champagne. But one thing was clear, the slate had been wiped frighteningly clean. The war ended one world and left everyone scrambling to make sense of the next. In April 1904, a flamboyant British adventurer named Aleister Crowley was holed up in a Cairo hotel room, engaged in an activity that would scandalize and mystify many for decades. Crowley, poet, mountaineer, and self-proclaimed sorcerer, claimed he spent 3 days in a trance, transcribing a holy book dictated to him by a mysterious entity. This entity, which Crowley called Aiwass, purportedly spoke from beyond human reality, delivering a new gospel for a new age. The result was the Book of the Law, and its most famous or infamous line was a blunt commandment. "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Do what thou wilt." On first hearing, it sounds like a hedonist charter. Do whatever you want. And indeed, Crowley's bohemian fans loved interpreting it that way. But Crowley meant something more profound and more individualistic. He was declaring the dawn of a new spiritual era in which the individual human will would replace external authority as the guiding principle. In his cosmology, the Old Age, which he labeled the Aeon of Osiris, had been about paternalistic, top-down rule. Society organized like a hierarchy with a father figure, or god emperor, at the top. The New Age, the Aeon of Horus, would be like a willful child. "Every man and every woman is a star," proclaimed Crowley. Each individual a bright point of their own, moving under their own will in the cosmos. In short, the individual would now be the center of meaning. Crowley crowned himself prophet of this new age. He delighted in outraging the establishment, styling himself as the Great Beast 666, dabbling in dark magic and drugs, and, supposedly, performing occult rituals in bizarre places like the Great Pyramid. To the tabloids, he was the wickedest man in the world. But behind the theater, Crowley was tapping into something real, the rising tide of individualism in the 20th century. Traditional religion, with its demand for obedience to an all-powerful God and church, was waning, especially in Europe. Political structures that emphasized duty to monarch or state were crumbling. In their place, a new ethos was emerging that celebrated personal freedom, self-expression, and the primacy of one's inner conscience over external rules. "Do what thou wilt" encapsulated this ethos, albeit in a deliberately provocative way. Crowley didn't literally mean do anything that crosses your mind. He wasn't advocating chaos or cruelty. He meant that if each person discovered their true will, their authentic purpose or path, and followed it, that would be the whole of the moral law. No need for the 10 Commandments or an authoritarian moral code. Your duty was to be yourself fully. It was a spiritual justification for what society was already moving toward in more secular ways. Personal liberty. The rise of individualism can be traced back centuries, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, etc., but the 20th century put it into overdrive and into everyday life. Consider how, in the late 19th century, most people's identities were largely defined by their family, social class, and religion. By the mid-20th century, especially in the West, that had shifted dramatically. People were urged to be yourself, to choose paths that suited them personally. The notion of the self-made man, or woman, became a cultural ideal, whether that was an entrepreneur, an artist, or simply someone who charted their own course. Individual rights movements blossomed. Women's suffrage, demanding individual political rights for women. Later civil rights, LGBT rights, etc. All asserted that each person's will and choice should be respected, not subsumed by some overarching social hierarchy. When the 20th century began, the world still believed it had a center. Greenwich told time. Empires dictated truth. God, science, and the state all seemed to agree that the universe was ordered, measured, and stable. But as we've seen, that illusion didn't survive for long. Einstein quietly erased the coordinates of the cosmos. He showed that the center, the omphalos around which everything spun, wasn't real. Motion and time themselves depended on where you were standing. That wasn't just a physics problem, it was a philosophical earthquake. If there's no fixed point in space, then what else might not be fixed? Then came the wars. Not one, but 2 catastrophes that shredded the old myths of progress. The 20th century marched in with flags and optimism and walked out covered in mud, blood, and chemical smoke. The war didn't just kill millions, it killed the idea that history had a clean arc, that humanity was naturally advancing towards something better. Empires cracked, certainty died, and whatever fragile center still held, didn't. Into that vacuum stepped the individual. If the world has no objective center, maybe the self can be the center. Do what thou wilt. The 20th century didn't just decentralize power, it decentralized meaning. Religion, nation, tradition, all of it could be challenged, rewritten, or ignored. The new God was choice. The new battlefield was identity. And that, more than any single event, is why the 20th century still feels strange to us. It didn't just change what people believed, it changed how belief itself works. It took the compass out of human hands and left everyone to draw their own maps. What began with a physicist challenging Newton, continued with nations tearing themselves apart, and ended with the rise of radical individuality. Three forces, science, war, and selfhood, shattered the idea of a shared center. And in many ways, we're still living in the aftershocks. This essay is adapted from John Higgs's book, Stranger Than We Can Imagine, specifically chapters 1, 3, and 4. If you enjoyed this video, check out the full book. Also like, comment, and subscribe.